Good afternoon, everybody. Before we get started, just a few things. As I'm sure you know, or you should know, exam one is next class. That is on Thursday. Remember that each exam is basically 30 multiple choice questions. So there's a couple of ways that I can do this. I think what I'm going to do, though, is give you all the questions over Top Hat, okay? So what's going to happen is that I will throw a question up on Top Hat. I'll leave it up for about 60 to 90 seconds, somewhere in there, just to make sure everyone has enough time to answer that question. Move on to the next question. Because there are 30 questions, I anticipate this taking about 40 minutes, somewhere in there. If there's a question that is maybe a little more difficult than others or is a little longer than others, I can leave it up for a couple minutes. That way, everyone should have enough time to go through all the questions. That way, your exam will also be graded basically instantaneously. So you'll have your exam score immediately after the exam. You don't have to wait for any grading or anything like that. So I think that's what we're going to do. The only drawback, or I guess I should say one of the drawbacks of this, is that once the exam is started, we won't be able to go back to a prior question once it's already been done. So what that means is that I need all of you to make sure you are here on time. If you come in a couple minutes late, if we've already started the exam, you might have missed a couple questions. So just make sure you are here on Zoom by 3:30 on Thursday, okay? Also, you might have noticed this, that I have posted the study guide for exam one on Canvas in the module section. So you should be able to see that. Remember that those questions in the study guide are not the questions that are going to be on the exam. The study guide is just a way for you to assess whether you know the material. So remember that my tip for you is to study beforehand, before you even look at the study guide, then put everything away, pull up the study guide and see if you can answer those questions. If you can, you can feel pretty good about your knowledge. If there's certain questions you can't answer, that means you need to study those topics a little bit more. So yes, the question in the chat is on Zoom. Yeah, we're gonna have the exam. It'll be over Zoom. So make sure you're on Zoom with your Top Hat account up and running. And then we'll get started at 3:30 on Thursday. Okay, first off, are there any questions about the exam on Thursday? Yes, you should be on Zoom on Thursday. We're going to do it over Zoom. There are 30 questions, 30 multiple choice questions. Do we need a camera? Not for this exam. It's possible I could require one for future exams, but not for Thursday. It's too short notice just in case you don't have a camera ready. So. Okay, anything else? Any other questions? You're going to go over the. I'm not sure what you mean when you say I'm going to go over the questions. I'm not going to go over the questions that are going to be on the exam. There is a study guide that is posted, but again, that study guide does not have the exact questions that are on the exam. Yes, everything's multiple choice. Okay, if there's any other questions that you have about the exam, I can take it up at the end of today's class. Before we get started, though, I do want to do one thing. If you could open up your Top Hat account. We're going to do the quiz at the end of today's class. Don't let me forget that we're going to do a quiz. We'll do that in about an hour. But I still want you to open up your Top Hat account because I have one little task for you to do. How much time for each question? As I said, about 60 to 90 seconds, somewhere in there. Okay, remember, I'll always give you a countdown when there's 10 seconds left. That should be plenty of time for each question. I don't want to rush you, but I've also got to keep everyone on pace to make sure that we finish that exam by the end of class. So about 90 seconds or so. Okay, everyone's got their Top Hat opened up? Okay. So, yeah, I know it's not ideal that you can't go back to prior questions. That is true. That is not ideal. That's partly a function of COVID. The problem is any way I have of administering this exam, there's problems with any way I do it if it's not in person. So that is the one drawback. I agree with you. Honestly, I'm not going to rush you at all. I really don't want to rush anybody. So hopefully there shouldn't be any need to go back. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a very simple question. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It is an anonymous question, so I'm not even going to know if you responded per se. But it's just a very simple task. Okay, so I want you to imagine the following. I want you to imagine that a crime was committed and a witness to this crime described the perpetrator in the following manner. Okay. They described the perpetrator as being a Caucasian woman, average height, average build, dirty blonde hair, and about college age. And I want you to imagine that the police have a suspect and they've placed that suspect in a lineup with 5 people who they know to be innocent. And this is the lineup that they've created. And what I want you to do is to tell me who you think the suspect is in this lineup. Okay. And I want everyone to guess, or at least give me some sort of response, 1 through 6. Okay, so you're not able to say none of the above. You have to guess who the suspect is based on this description here. So I'm going to give you a minute to answer that, and then we'll tell you why I'm doing this. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Okay. Thank you for this. I appreciate it. I asked you this question because the research that I do in particular has to do with eyewitness memory. And in particular, I'd research lineups and the best way to present lineups to witnesses to crimes. And as part of the studies that I run, I have to create a lot of lineups to show participants like yourself. And the lineups that I create have to meet certain criteria. And by having you respond to this question, that helps me ensure that the lineups that I've created for the studies that I'm running meet those criteria. Basically, the basic idea here is that if a lineup is constructed fairly, then what that means is that people who have never seen the criminal, which are you guys basically, should have no idea who the suspect in the lineup is, given a description of that person. And so what I'm hoping by collecting data from you guys here is that people are more or less responding randomly. If I notice that, let's just say 60% of you are all picking the same person, then I know that's a problem with the lineup because that person's really standing out. So hopefully I get roughly an even distribution of people just picking from this lineup. That's the basic idea. Let me just see how you guys did actually respond to this. Oops. Okay, so that's not too bad. So you can see that people are responding sort of all over the place. Every lineup member got some picks. Looks like number 3 got a few more than everybody else, but that's not that big a deal. So that's good. That's more or less what I'm looking for, which that suggests that this is a fair lineup and I can use it in the studies that I'm conducting. So you just helped me out there making some stimulus materials for my study. So I thank you for doing that. Okay. Before we get started with today's lecture, I just want to show you a quick video. You should be able to hear my audio or hear the audio from this. Again, if you can't hear the audio, just let me know in the chat, but you should be able to hear it. I'm going to show you a couple clips from a show that was on a number of years ago, probably 15 or 16 years ago, a show called WB Superstar. This is a show that's kind of like American Idol, but with one twist. Okay. So in American Idol, you have people singing for a panel of judges and the best singers could go through to the next round. In WB Superstar, the people who are singing to the judges are passing only the worst singers. Now the singers don't know this, right? The singers think they're really trying to be as good as possible, but the judges are turning down the good singers and sending the really, really bad singers on. So I want to show you a couple clips of a couple of these bad singers.
Funky Cold Medina.
Whoa, all right. Well, what song are you going to sing for us today?
I'm going to sing Celebration by Kool and the Gang.
Oh, that's one of my favorite songs, man. I like that.
Celebrate good times. Come on, let's celebrate. There's a party going on right here. a celebration to last throughout the years. So bring your good times and your laughter too. We're gonna celebrate and party with you. Come on now. Celebration. We're gonna celebrate and have a good time.
Come on, break it on down.
Celebrate good times. Come on.
We doing
Let's
a bump over
celebrate.
here. Whoa.
There's
Hey,
a party going on right
Whoa, here we
here.
go. Boom.
A dedication to
Hey.
last throughout the years. So bring your good times and your laughter too. We're gonna celebrate and party with you. Come on now.
Thank you.
All right.
Ah, Becky,
we needed
was
that.
hot. Yeah, we needed that one, man. That was
Needed
hot.
to break it down.
And you did a great job. You know what I'm saying? And all I can say is
That was
thank
really
you
fun.
very
fun.
much. I had a good time.
That was
I had a
fun.
blast.
You had me doing a bump over here.
Yeah.
You know, the last time I did the bump, yeah.
See, we can't stop.
Mario, I think we're all in agreement. You are one step closer to becoming a superstar.
Thank you.
All right.
Mario.
What'd I tell you, man?
Okay, let's look at one more.
Funky Cold Medina.
Same one. Okay, maybe I don't have the other one. Okay, that's fine. You guys get the idea of how that show works. And, you know, quite honestly, this is a pretty evil show, right? Like they're kind of making fun of these people in front of an audience and they don't even know they're being made fun of. And I'm not showing you this clip in order to make fun of these people. I'm showing you this clip to make a point, which is that the only reason that this show works is because everyone can see how bad of a singer these people are, other than one person, the singer themselves, right? They're the only people who don't seem to be able to understand how bad of a singer they are. Why is that the case? How can they not understand how bad of a singer they are when everyone else can see this? What I'm going to argue in today's class, kind of the theme of today's class, is that in a sense, we are all like these singers on WB Superstar. Maybe not as obviously, we're not placed in as public a forum as these people are, but there's a sense in which we're all kind of like these singers. In other words, we all tend to think we're better than we really are on some dimensions. That's going to be the theme of today's class, as we're going to see. Okay, let me find my PowerPoint. So if you recall from last class, we focused last class on the cognitive component of the self. Oops. This last component, right? How we come to know ourselves, how we come to form a self-concept. We're going to change tracks a little bit and focus now on the affective component of the self. So we're not talking about how we come to know ourselves, but rather how we feel about ourselves or how we evaluate ourselves. And what I'm going to argue is that, as we saw last class, there are certain ways that we can come to know ourselves, right? Through a social comparison process or through self-perception or things like that. And what I'm going to argue first off, though, is that under a lot of circumstances, maybe under most circumstances, we don't even really want to know ourselves at a deep level. Let me lay out the logic for why this is the case. And this is based on a social psychological phenomenon known as self-awareness effects. Here's the basic idea. Under most circumstances, we are not generally directly focused on ourselves. So right now you're hopefully listening to me and looking at my slides and maybe taking notes, but you're not thinking about who you are as a person, right? So you're not really generally self-focused under most circumstances. But there are certain situations that lead us to become self-focused. So for instance, if I place a mirror in front of you and you look at yourself in the mirror, you are literally focused on yourself, right? If you watch yourself in a video, or if you look at yourself in photographs, or if you listen to your voice on a tape recorder, all of these things lead you to become focused on yourself. When you're focused on yourself, social psychologists say that you've entered a state of self-awareness. When you're in a state of self-awareness, there's a couple things that happen. First off, there's this natural tendency that we have when we enter a state of self-awareness to start comparing ourselves to a standard. So for instance, maybe when you pass by yourself in a mirror and you see what you look like, you start thinking of, oh my gosh, this is what I look like. You wish you looked like this. You have this idealized standard. You wish you looked a little bit different. You wish your hair was a little different. You you wish your skin was a little bit different, whatever it is, right? That's often what happens when we enter a state of self-awareness. You might have had this experience if you listen to your voice on a tape recorder, you start hearing your voice and you wish your voice sounded like something else, right? You start comparing who you actually are to this idealized standard. Now that can happen in a physical sense. So you see yourself and you wish you looked differently, but it can happen in a behavioral sense too, meaning you might look at yourself and the behaviors you're engaged in right now, and you start comparing yourself to this idealized behavior a way in which you think you should be behaving. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. The point right now is that when you enter a state of self-awareness, we start naturally comparing ourselves to this idealized version of ourselves, the standard. The problem is that in comparing ourselves to the standard, we always fall short, right? Because this is an idealized version of who we are. It's not who we actually are. So we start noticing all the discrepancies between who we are currently and how we wished we were, how we wished we could be. And when we see all of our shortcomings in that sense, we don't really like that. We don't feel good about that. It leads to discomfort. If you see yourself in a mirror and you start comparing yourself to this idealized physical version of yourself that you wish you looked like, you feel bad about how you currently look because you're not meeting that standard. Similarly, if you're engaged in some, let's say, unethical behavior, and you look at yourself in a mirror and you start comparing your current unethical behavior with this idealized behavior, how you know you should be behaving, you start to feel bad about your unethical behavior that you're engaged in. So it leads to this discomfort. And we are highly motivated to get rid of discomfort. We don't like it, right? So what do we do? Well, in order to cope with that discomfort, we can do one of two things generally. The first thing we can do is to behave in ways that reduce that discrepancy, because that discrepancy is what's causing us to feel bad. So we can reduce that discrepancy. So if you notice yourself in a mirror and you see your hair is not doing so well, you wish it looked differently, you could try to change your hair to make it look like your idealized self. Or if you're engaged in unethical behavior and you see yourself in a mirror and you start comparing your current unethical behavior to this idealized version of what behavior you should be engaging in, you could stop engaging in that unethical behavior. That brings you closer in line with that idealized version that reduces the discomfort. So that's one way that we can cope with things. A second way that we can cope with things is that we can simply withdraw from self-awareness. I mean, after all, it's the mirror that caused you to enter that state of self-awareness in the first place. So maybe you don't want to reduce the discrepancy, or maybe you just don't know how to reduce the discrepancy. And so what you do is you stop looking at yourself in the mirror. You might have had this experience, let's say in, grade school or junior high or high school, when you have picture day, and then when you get your pictures later on in the semester, and at least when I was in school, what I saw a lot of people do is they look at their pictures, say, oh, and then they put them face down on their desk and they don't want to look at them ever again, right? Why are they doing that? Because by looking at their own pictures, they enter a state of self-awareness. They're self-focused, right? They start comparing themselves with this idealized standard. They start noticing all the discrepancies between how they look and how they wish they looked. That causes them discomfort, so they withdraw from self-awareness. They turn the picture face down. Or maybe you've heard your voice on a tape recorder. And most people don't like the sound of their voice on a tape recorder, right? Because when you listen to it, you start comparing your current voice to how you wish your voice sounded. You start noticing the discrepancies. It makes you feel bad. So what do? We withdraw from self-awareness. We stop the tape recorder. We don't want to listen to our voice anymore. Right? This happens a lot. I'm sure you have been in states of self-awareness yourself, where you've engaged in some behavior like this. Right? Now, the point is that this leads us to not really want to know who we are at a deeper level, because if we really focused on who we really actually were, we'd start noticing all the discrepancies between who we currently are and how we wished we were. We feel bad about it. So my argument here is that we often don't want to know ourselves because knowing ourselves makes us feel bad about ourselves. So we'll often engage in psychological strategies to avoid having to face up to the fact that we're not living up to our idealized version of ourselves. And I want to give you some examples of these types of effects. This is a study where what researchers did is on Halloween, they had a number of houses around a neighborhood. And what they did is they took a bowl of candy and they left it outside the door underneath a sign that said, "Please take one." So this might happen if they're not at home or something, right? Now you can imagine that what happens with kids is they come up to a house, there's no one around, there's a bowl of candy underneath the sign that says, please take one. They look around, they grab a handful and they take off, right? So what the researchers wanted to know though is whether they can use this idea of self-awareness to reduce the likelihood that kids would steal candy. So what they did is that in half of these houses, right behind the bowl of candy was a mirror. So what happens is that if you're one of these kids and you go up to this house and there's a bowl of candy and a sign that says, please take one. And you may be thinking to yourself, I'm going to steal some candy. But in order to do so, you've got to look at yourself in the mirror as you're doing it. And that makes things a little harder, right? Because what's happening is that when these kids look at themselves in the mirror, they enter a state of self-awareness. They're noticing their current behavior. I'm stealing candy. They know that they shouldn't be stealing candy. That's their idealized behavior. They notice all the discrepancies. I start to feel bad that I'm not living up to my idealized self. In order to reduce that discomfort, what can I do? Well, I can reduce the discrepancies between my current self and my idealized self. In other words, if I don't steal candy in the first place, I don't have to feel bad when I'm looking at myself in the mirror. So that's exactly what these researchers found, is that simply placing a mirror behind the bowl drastically reduced the likelihood that these kids would steal candy because they were in a state of self-awareness. And these effects happen not just with kids, but they happen with college students as well. This is a study that looked at student cheating on a test. And what they did in the study is they placed students in a room where they had to fill out some or answer some questions. And if they answered questions correctly, they got some bonus in some way, some money or something like that. The point is that these students had a motivation to do well on the test, right? And they placed them in a room by themselves where there were secret cameras that were filming them. And so they can tell if the students cheated. And in half of the rooms in which these students were placed, there was a mirror at the other end of the table, and in half the rooms there wasn't. Other than that, the two groups were identical. And the researchers could then see whether placing a mirror in the room reduced the likelihood that these students would cheat, which is exactly what happened. Because again, if you are a student in this room, if you wanted to cheat, you had to look at yourself in the mirror while doing it, which leads you to enter a state of self-awareness. You compare your current behavior, I'm cheating, to your idealized behavior, I shouldn't be cheating. That makes you feel bad. To get rid of that bad feeling, you stop cheating. Other researchers have used a similar trick to reduce the likelihood that people will stereotype. So in this study, what students did is they were shown a series of faces on a computer, just like a still image of a face. And if I show you a still image of a face and now I ask you, okay, I want you to rate this person on a number of dimensions. How honest do you think they are? How aggressive are they? Things like that. Now, under normal circumstances, if the only thing we have to go on to form our impression is someone's face, we tend to stereotype that person. We stereotype them based on their sex, based on their race, based on their age. And so we rate them accordingly to those stereotypes, right? But what happens is that for half of the students who were doing this task, the researchers every now and then would flash their name on the screen, the participant's name. Okay. Now you can imagine that, let's say right now, I flashed your name on the screen right now. You would notice that, right? You would enter a state of self-awareness. You start thinking about yourself, like why are they flashing my name on the screen? Start thinking about yourself. So by flashing people's names on the screen, that led them to enter a state of self-awareness. And among those participants who were in the state of awareness, or state of self-awareness, they were less likely to stereotype people based on that image than were people who weren't in that state of self-awareness. The idea being that when your name is flashed on the screen, you enter a state of self-awareness. You start noticing your current behavior. I'm stereotyping people a lot. You start noticing your idealized behavior. I shouldn't be stereotyping. That makes you feel bad. So you stop stereotyping people to reduce that discomfort. So these are all examples of how entering a state of self-awareness can lead people to engage in, let's say, more ethical behavior. That's one way that we had of escaping self-awareness. The second way, as I mentioned, is to escape the situation that caused self-awareness to begin with. And that's what this study looked at here. In this study, participants were given, they filled out some personality questionnaires. Then they were given bogus feedback. This bogus feedback had nothing to do with their responses to the questionnaires, but they were led to believe that it did. And the bogus feedback they got was either positive or negative. And so negative feedback would be something like, this person has trouble making friends, people don't like them very much, just things like that, things that like kind of hurt, right, if you get that feedback. This study then supposedly ends after people randomly get this negative feedback or not. And the participants go to what they believe is a second study. In fact, it's just a continuation of the first study. But in this apparent second study, they're told that they're going to have to taste a series of wines and rate the wines. Now, what the researchers are really wanting to know, though, is whether the people who got this negative feedback in the first part of the study and enter a state of self-awareness, because when you get negative feedback about yourself as a person, you enter the state of self-awareness that causes you to feel bad. And one way to escape feeling bad is to drink alcohol. Alcohol lets us escape that sense of self-awareness. And so what they showed is that those people who got negative feedback on the first part of the study drank more wine in the second part of the study in an attempt to escape the negative feelings associated with self-awareness. Okay. So we really don't like to think about ourselves too much in a lot of circumstances because of these negative feelings that arise as a consequence. Okay. We're not always motivated, in other words, to find accurate information about ourselves. Now, we sometimes are. If you are practicing a skill, for instance, let's say you play basketball. If you really want to improve at playing basketball, you really need to know what you're good at, what you're bad at, what you need to practice at. So if you're really truly motivated to better yourself, we can find accurate information about ourselves. We can look for accurate information. But under a lot of other situations, we just don't want to. So if we're not motivated to find accurate information, what information are we motivated to find? Well, one of the general themes in social psychology, something that pops up all over the place, is that people are really strongly motivated to find not accurate information, but self-enhancing information. In other words, we really like to feel good about ourselves. And so we really like positive feedback. We are all, in a sense, like this kitten looking into a mirror and seeing a lion stare back at themselves. Right? This is why these singers in WB Superstar, this is why they're the only ones that can't see how bad of a singer that they are, right? Because they don't want that accurate feedback that makes them feel bad. They want the positive feedback. They readily accept this positive feedback that the judges are giving because it makes them feel good about themselves. And that's one of the fundamental motivations that drives a lot of behavior, this motivation to want to feel good about ourselves. So what we're really talking about when we get down to it is self-esteem. Okay, in other words, self-esteem is the affective component of the self. It's how we feel about ourselves. So just like the self-concept is the sum total of everything we think about ourselves, self-esteem is the sum total of everything we feel about ourselves. So you have certain qualities that you really like about yourself, certain qualities you don't like about yourself. All of that together forms your self-esteem. And we really like high self-esteem. That's the idea. That's why we look for self-enhancing information. We really like to feel good about ourselves. There are a number of positive outcomes associated with having high self-esteem. So for instance, there's been like hundreds of studies looking at the effects of raising or lowering people's self-esteem. Right? And we know that people who have higher self-esteem tend to have better health. Now that's not really a causal link, that's probably more of a correlational link. But people with higher self-esteem tend to have better health. We know for sure that people who have higher self-esteem are happier. That's really a really easy study to do. You simply manipulate people's self-esteem in some way or another based on feedback you give them, and you measure how happy they are. People really are happy if they have high self-esteem. People who have higher self-esteem are more confident. They tend to be more persistent at tasks. They're less likely to give up, for instance, if they encounter an obstacle. So there are certainly some positive benefits associated with having higher self-esteem. Now, a lot of people think that there's a lot more benefits to having high self-esteem. I mentioned in the first week that there was this task force in California that believed that if you raise people's self-esteem, that would reduce their likelihood of trying drugs or teenage pregnancy or things like that. That doesn't seem to be the case, okay? High self-esteem doesn't solve every problem. But there are certain positive positive aspects associated with having high self-esteem. And most relevant to our purposes now is the idea that having high self-esteem makes people happier. We like to have high self-esteem. And because we like to have high self-esteem, we will often engage in all sorts of psychological tactics, all sorts of psychological tricks in order to convince ourselves that we're actually better than we really are. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on this lecture, is what those psychological tricks are, ways that we kind of lie to ourselves a little bit, or the biased ways in which we gather information in order to convince ourselves we're actually better than we really are, so that therefore we can be happier. Okay, so we really want high self-esteem. Well, what do people actually think about themselves? Turns out that in this culture, at least, in Western cultures at least, people tend to think really highly of themselves. We love ourselves in this culture. It has been said by some people that we suffer from low self-esteem. That's complete nonsense. For the most part, the majority of people think really highly of themselves. There are exceptions, obviously. And we're going to look at one or two of them a little later on. But for the most part, most people tend to think highly of themselves. And we know this from a number of different sources. So for instance, the other, when was this? Last week, I think it was, when I had you fill in the I am blank, right? And you guys filled it in with personality characteristics. And one of the things I mentioned was how many people filled it in with more positive than negative traits. And that was true of just about everybody in the class. That when you think about yourself, when you list your traits, you are much more likely to list positive traits than you are to list negative traits. And there's a number of ways that we can look at this. You can give people a list of traits and have them tell you how much does this trait describe you. And most people say that positive traits describe them very well and negative traits don't describe them at all. Furthermore, if I have you rate yourself on traits, and then I have you rate your friends on those very same traits, typically what happens is you will rate yourself higher on positive traits than you rate your friends, and lower on negative traits than you rate your friends. In other words, you think higher of yourself than you think of your friends. But what's also interesting is that if I gave your friends that same checklist and they rated themselves and they rated you, they would rate themselves higher than they rate you. And so in other words, you like yourself more than your friends like you. Very consistent with this. In fact, there's all sorts of other findings that are all consistent with this general principle, right? You could even ask people, what are your favorite letters of the alphabet? And the letters that people state are their favorite letters are more likely than chance to be letters that exist in their own name. Because not only do we like ourselves, we like anything associated with ourselves. We like our name, and so I like the letters that are in my name. Maybe you've had this experience where, let's say you buy a car, okay? Let's say you buy a Toyota, and your friend's looking for a car, and they're thinking about a Toyota or a Honda or something, and they eventually go with a Honda. And it almost feels like they personally insulted you. Or if they say anything bad about Toyotas, you get all defensive and insulted by it, right? As if you designed Toyotas, right? But what's happening here is that as soon as you buy something, you've made a decision. I like Toyotas. And if someone questions that, we don't like that. Because if it turns out that Toyotas aren't that good a car, and I bought a Toyota, I have to think negatively of myself, right? So we get all defensive about these things in order to maintain this high self-esteem, because we tend to think really highly of ourselves. So the question then is this: if we think not only highly of ourselves, but sort of unjustifiably highly of ourselves, how can this unrealistically high self-esteem be maintained? If you think you're better than you actually are, if you think you're better than everyone else thinks you are at something, don't you think you get feedback from the real world that would allow you to correct your perceptions of yourself? I mean, the singers in that show, don't they get feedback that they're not great singers and therefore they should come to learn they're not great singers? How can people maintain this unrealistically high self-esteem? That's what we're going to look at now. So in this section, self-enhancement, which is I think always going to be on the left of the top of each slide, refers to this tendency to want to think really highly of ourselves. And the term on the right-hand side of each of these slides is the specific technique that people use in order to self-enhance. So we're going to talk about a number of them. We're going to start with self-serving cognitions. Cognitions just refers to beliefs that we have, right? So self-serving cognitions means we will specifically adopt beliefs because they are self-serving, because they raise our self-esteem. Let's look at what some of these are. So for instance, the majority of people in this culture, at the very least, think that they are better than average for most positive traits. So for instance, if I were to ask you, let's say, how honest are you? And I have you rate yourself in relation to other people. So are you about average honesty, below average, above average? The majority of people will say they're above average in honesty. But that can't be the case because basically by definition, most people can't be better than most people, right? Only half of the people can be above average at most. And yet you'll get something like 75% of people think they're above average. And that's true on virtually every positive trait that you can imagine. If I ask you to rate how good are you at driving, well, how are your driving skills? Most people, including people in Miami who have like the worst driving skills of anywhere I've ever been, most people in Miami will say they're better than average drivers, okay? Which cannot be the case. But it's true for how intelligent you are, how healthy you are, how ethical you are. What's sort of funny, you can ask people to rate themselves on a number of these dimensions, right? And one of the ones you can give them is, how humble are you? And people say, oh yeah, I'm really humble. The majority of people will brag about how humble they are, in other words. Because we have these self-serving cognitions. It makes us feel good to convince ourselves that we're better than average on these traits. Okay, there's one study that looked at high school seniors who were graduating, and they had to rate themselves on a number of dimensions, including how well do you get along with other people? Are you in the top 1%, top 5%, top 10%, et cetera? And 25% of these high school seniors said that they were in the top 1% in terms of how well they get along with others, which cannot possibly be the case. Only 1% of people can be in the top 1% of people, right? So the vast majority of these people who think they're in the top 1% are really not. So in 1997, and I'm sure you can find all sorts of examples, more recent examples of this as well, but here's one that I picked. There was a survey that went out to people. So asked them the following question: assuming that heaven exists, who is likely to go there? And they would list people on the left-hand side, and the percentage you're going to see on the right-hand side, this is the percentage of people who agreed that that person would go to heaven, assuming that heaven exists. So here are some of the people they asked them about. O.J. Simpson. This was right around the time of his murder trial. Understandably, not many people thought he would go to heaven after being accused of killing his ex-wife. Only 19%. They asked about Bill Clinton, who was president at the time. About 52% said he would go to heaven. Princess Diana. This was a few months before her death. She was quite popular. 60% of people said they thought she would go to heaven. Oprah, they asked about Oprah, because why not? About 2/3 of people said that they thought she would go to heaven. Mother Teresa, that's about 79% of people thought she would go to heaven. Mother Teresa was not the number one answer. The number one answer, 87% of people thought this person would go to heaven. You know what the number one answer is? Maybe you figured it out already. You. So, obviously, I'm going to heaven. I mean, Mother Teresa and Oprah and Princess Diana, I don't know what them, but I'm definitely going to heaven, right? Self-serving cognitions in action. This is what this shows, again, that we tend to really, really like ourselves. I'll give you a more up-to-date example. This is from a few years ago. What is this, 2014, okay, so that's almost 7 years ago. And they asked people a similar question, but in general, would you say that you are more intelligent, less intelligent, or about the same intelligence as the average American person? And this is the percentage of people who put themselves in each category. And as you can see, 19% said much more intelligent, 36% said a little bit more intelligent, 34% about the same intelligence, 3% said slightly less, 1% said much less intelligent, okay? So 4% of people think they're below average. That can't possibly be the case, right? There are a whole lot of people who are not very intelligent who are exaggerating how intelligent they actually are, right? Now, they don't know they're exaggerating. They truly believe that they are more intelligent than the average person. And there are a number of reasons for why this exists, okay? First off, I'll give you a couple. First reason is that intelligence is a bit of an ambiguous concept, right? You might be someone who fails every class that you've ever taken, right? And so you might think that you would recognize you're not very intelligent. But you know what? Maybe, you're not book smarts, but you're street smarts, right? And so what happens is, well, in terms of street smarts, I'm way more intelligent than the average person. So what happens is people define these terms in a way that maximizes their perceptions of themselves, right? That's one reason why you find these effects. Another reason, which is sort of interesting, is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically, it's based on a study that shows that people who are not intelligent, because they're not intelligent, they don't recognize what intelligence is. They're not smart enough to know what intelligence is. And so therefore, when they rate themselves on intelligence, they just simply don't know how to judge intelligence. So they judge themselves as being really high. So a less politically correct way of saying that would be that dumb people just are too dumb to know that they're dumb, basically, is the basic idea. Okay, so these are all examples of self-serving cognitions. This is one of the easiest effects to find in all of psychology, just because it's so common and so ubiquitous. It's not the only self-serving cognition. There are other ones as well. So for instance, if you fail or you succeed at a task, you get to decide whether you take credit or take responsibility for that, or whether you can maybe blame someone else. So for instance, what people tend to do is that when they succeed at a task, oh yeah, that's all because of me. If you take the exam on Thursday and you get perfect 30 out of 30, you're gonna say, you know what, that's because I'm a great student. I studied, I tried hard, I'm smart, I know social psychology, I'm taking the credit. However, if you fail the exam on Thursday, you know what, that Dr. Charman, he didn't teach me well, there was a trick questions, you're gonna blame someone else, like me, for instance, for failure. Right? So what happens is if you're only ever taking credit when you succeed and you blame others when you fail, then what happens? Your self-esteem can only go up. It never has to go down because you never have to take responsibility for failure, but it can go up when you succeed because you get to take all the credit. This happens all the time, okay? We've actually seen this. I mentioned this briefly in an earlier lecture, that people on a team in Western cultures, if after the team wins and you separate them and you ask them, how much did you contribute to your team's win? And if you add up all of those numbers, they almost always add up to more than 100%, meaning that on average, people are overestimating how much they contributed to their team's wins. And you get the exact opposite if the team lost. So if you ask people after a team lost, how much did you contribute? How much are you responsible for your team losing? If you ask people that in private, and you add up all the numbers, all the percentages they give you, that usually equals less than 100, meaning people are saying, oh, it wasn't me. I was like 5% responsible. It was like 95% everybody else. Okay, students do this with grades all the time. I have been blamed for students failing exams constantly. I've almost never been given credit if they succeeded at an exam though, because the students will take the credit themselves. But it's not just you guys that do this. Professors do this as well. Oh, I'm gonna get to that in 1 second. Professors do this as well. Professors fall prey to these sorts of biases just as strongly as students do. In fact, I forgot to mention this on the prior slide, but there was a study that showed that 94% of professors think they were a better than average professor, again, which is completely impossible, right? Gamblers do this. You know, I've always wondered about this because for any game in a casino that you're playing against the casino, which is most games, not all of them. Like poker, you play against other players, but for most other games, you're playing directly against the casino. That's true of like roulette or blackjack or whatever. Any game where you play against the casino, you are guaranteed to lose in the long run. That's how casinos stay in business. They basically have rigged things such that they have an edge in every single game, right? So people are guaranteed to lose money in the long run at casino games. So how is it that people keep going back to the casino week after week and spending money and spending money and spending money? Well, one of the reasons for that is because of these self-serving cognitions. If you're a blackjack player and you go to the casino and you have a great night and you win $500, Well, that's because you know the rules of blackjack. You know how to play. You know when to hit and when to stand and when to double down. You know exactly how to play. Then the next week you go and you lose $500. And that's because the dealer screwed you. And then the guy sitting beside you hit when he shouldn't have, and that gave you the wrong card, and he screwed you all up, and everything screwed you all up, right? It's always someone else's fault. So that way, gamblers who are actually losing money every time they go can convince themselves that they're actually making money, or that they're actually good players, good enough to beat the house because of these self-serving cognitions. This bad grade is lowering my self-esteem, says Calvin. This teacher says, then you should work harder so you don't get bad grades. To which Calvin replies, your denial of my victimhood is lowering my self-esteem. This is kind of accurate. That's exactly what happens, is that what's happening is that Calvin is getting a bad grade and he immediately wants to blame someone else because he knows it's lowering his self-esteem to get it. Blame the teacher. But the teacher refocuses the blame back onto Calvin. And because he can't claim victimhood, that his self-esteem actually lowers, right? This cartoon is bang on as to what actually happens with people. We don't want to take responsibility for our failures because that would lead us to lose self-esteem. We don't like that. Another self-serving cognition that people engage in is something known as unrealistic optimism. Unrealistic optimism is this belief that most people have, again, in this culture at the very least, that their futures will be better than the average person. So just like we think that we're more honest and trustworthy and smarter than the average person, we also think our futures are better than the average person. If you think about your likelihood of getting divorced at some point in your life, for instance, if you ask a group of people, which I normally do in a class in person, if I ask my class of 100 people, who's going to get divorced in their life? I get 3 hands that go up. But in reality, the divorce rate's like 50%, basically, right? So way, way more people are going to get divorced than think they're going to get divorced, but no one thinks it's going to be them, right? Because we think our futures are going to be better than that of the average person. And that's true in terms of a number of things, in terms of people think they're going to be happier than the average person, they're going to have a better job than the average person, they're less likely to get divorced, they're going to be healthier, less likely to have a heart attack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our futures are always very rosy, in other words. Why is that the case? Well, there's one study that looked at this that showed this effect in a sort of interesting way. And so what they did is this. They interviewed college freshmen. And of these college freshmen, some of them had been in a serious dating relationship in high school, and some of them had not been. Okay? So they asked them, do you think your future dating life is going to be better or worse than the average person? And what you typically find is that most people say, oh yeah, it'll be better than that of the average person. And so the researchers asked them, okay, so why is that? Why do you think your future dating life will be better than that of the average person? Now, if that student had been in a serious dating relationship in high school, they say something like this. Well, I was dating in high school. I had a serious relationship in high school. So I knew how to interact with people. I knew how to compromise. I knew how to communicate. I learned all of these skills at a young age of how to interact with my dating partners. I can use that knowledge going forward. And therefore, that's why I think my future dating life is going to be better than the average person. Okay, fair enough. So the researchers asked someone who had not been in a dating relationship in high school, why do you think your future is going to be better than the average person in terms of your dating life? And these students say, well, in high school, I didn't date a whole lot. I was single. And because I was single, I really got to learn about who I am as a person. I got to know what I like and what I dislike. I wasn't just dating anyone. And because of that, I developed a stronger sense of who I am, which is going to be really useful going forward in my dating life. And that's why my future dating life is going to be better than the average person. In other words, what happens is that when you think about how your future is going to be, you think about your past and you say, whatever happened in my past, that's the thing that leads me to think that my future is going to be better than average. Whatever happened to you, you think that matters going into the future, right? So if you come from, for instance, a well-off family and you were raised in a family that had lots of money, and you say, well, I had lots of privileges growing up. And because of all the privileges I had, that's obviously what's going to lead me to have a better job than most other people because of all the privileges and the tutoring and all the money my family had. And if you come from a poor family, you say, well, I came from a poor family, so I had to pull myself up from the bootstraps and I had to try harder than the average person. And that instilled in me the skills that I need to have a better job than the average person in the future. Again, whatever happened to you in the past, you convince yourself is the thing that leads you to predict a better future. However, there are consequences of having unrealistic optimism. There are some negative consequences. I mean, it feels good, right? Because we can have this good self-esteem, our future is going to be better than average. But there are some negative consequences of this as well. Because what that means is that if you're not likely, if you convince yourself you're not likely to die in a car accident, it doesn't matter if you wear a seatbelt. And if you convince yourself you're not likely to die of cancer because your future is better than average, you don't have to worry about putting suntan lotion on when you go to the beach, right? So what happens is that we don't take these preventative measures now because we don't think these negative things are going to happen to us in the future. That has some negative consequences. Okay. This is a study that looked at sexually active undergraduate women and whether they used contraception or not. And they asked these women to predict their risk of developing or having an unplanned pregnancy at some point in the next year. And what the researchers showed is that those women who were not using contraception rated their risk as lower than the women who were using contraception, which is the exact opposite of what's reality, right? Because what happened here is that if these sexually active undergraduate women were not using birth control, it's sort of threatening to think that their choices might lead to this negative outcome, this unplanned pregnancy. And so they start convincing themselves that for whatever reason, my future is going to be better than average. I am less likely to actually get pregnant, okay? Because it's a way to get rid of that negative feeling that their actions might lead to a negative future. Okay, so those are self-serving cognitions. Let's talk about a couple other strategies that people have as well. And we'll first start by talking about false consensus. This is a tendency that we have, that when we are estimating how many other people also share our opinions or also share our undesirable or negative behaviors, we have a tendency to overestimate that. So for example, up here, yeah. So you might have heard things like this. Let's say that you go out and you have a few drinks and then you drive home, and you know you shouldn't drive home after you've had a few drinks, right? You might be a little bit buzzed. And you start thinking, you know what though? Everyone drinks and drives. Now, that's not true, of course. Not everyone drinks and drives. Lots of people don't drink and drive. But what you've done is that by convincing yourself that everyone also engages in that negative behavior, it's not that big a deal if you do it, right? You don't have to feel bad about doing it if you can convince yourself that everyone also engages in the same undesirable behaviors. And this applies for all sorts of different behaviors as well, right? So if you cheat on your taxes to get more money, you tend to be motivated to convince yourself that everyone cheats on their taxes. Again, so you don't have to feel bad about the fact that you did it. Or if you are, let's say you're trying to quit smoking, let's say you think smoking is an undesirable behavior, you might convince yourself everyone else smokes as well, right? If you listen, you will hear people say these sorts of things all the time, that everyone else does this as well, so it's not that big a deal. It's not true that everyone else does it, but what they're engaging in is the false consensus effect. The belief that there's this huge consensus in terms of other people engaging in the same undesirable behaviors. This also occurs, as the definition states, for the opinions that you hold. So if you have a certain political opinion or a religious opinion or a moral opinion or whatever it is, right? Whatever opinion you hold, you have a natural inclination, a natural motivation to overestimate how many other people agree with you. And the reason for that is because if you acknowledge that your opinion is minority and not many people agree with you, you might be wrong. But if you can convince yourself that everyone agrees with you, well, now you can convince yourself that your opinion is correct, right? So people overestimate the extent to which other people share in their opinions. And again, you can see that this strategy of kind of lying to ourselves is aimed at maintaining a high level of self-esteem. The opposite of the false consensus effect is what's called the false uniqueness effect. And this is a situation in which we tend to underestimate how many people agree with us. And this applies when we're thinking about our good qualities, our desirable behaviors. Maybe, for instance, you donate money to charity. That's a desirable behavior, right? Well, if you can convince yourself that no one cares about people like you do, no one else donates money to charity like you do, you get to feel really good about yourself, right? So we have a natural inclination to underestimate how many other people also donate money to charity. And that's true for anything positive, any ability that we have. If you're good at something, if you have a positive quality, we have a tendency to want to underestimate how many other people also share that quality. That way we get to feel special about having that quality. There are, for instance, a large or fairly large proportion of undergraduate students who don't drink. Let's call them alcohol abstainers. And what some research has shown is that when you ask people who abstain from alcohol, how many other people also abstain from alcohol? How many other people don't drink as well? These people tend to say almost no one. Everyone's getting drunk all the time. I'm like one of the only people that does this. Now that's not true. There's a fairly large number of undergraduates that don't drink alcohol at all. But what's happened here is that these people who don't drink alcohol view that as a desirable behavior, and therefore they engage in the false uniqueness effect to convince themselves that if they're the only ones that are doing it, then they get to feel good about themselves. I'm going to skip over this example just to make sure we have enough time to get through all the material for the exam. But it's the same principle as everything we've been talking about, so you don't need to know that for the exam. All right, another strategy that we have is something called basking in reflected glory, which is sometimes referred to by its acronym, BIRG, Burging. Basking in reflected glory refers to the idea that there's a couple ways that we can get self-esteem. We can get self-esteem by being successful ourselves and taking credit for it, or we can get self-esteem sort of vicariously. If we can simply associate ourselves with successful other people, then that's kind of like basking in their reflected glory. So the glory hits them and it reflects off them and comes on to you. You get to sort of vicariously get self-esteem by simply associating yourself with successful other people. This is why, for instance, if you meet a famous person that you like, and one of the things people want to do most is have someone take a picture of them and you post it to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, right? You want everyone to know that you met this famous person. Now, why? Well, why? Because you are associating yourself with a successful other person. And the idea is that if other people think highly of them, you get to vicariously receive some of that self-esteem as well. So we like to associate ourselves with successful other people, in other words. Okay. Some research has looked at, for instance, what they've done is they've gone to on-campus bars at various universities, and they simply counted up the number of people, the number of students in that bar, wearing some item of clothing representing that team, okay, or representing their school. And they do this either the day after their football team had won or lost the game. And what they showed is that the football team had won the game the day before. People are more likely to be wearing some sort of clothing that indicates what school they went to than if their team had lost the prior day. Because we like to associate ourselves with winners, in other words. We get to bask in the reflected glory. You can even hear this in the language that some people use when talking about their favorite sports teams. So they might say, if you ask someone who follows sports and you ask them, did your team win? People are more likely to say something like, oh, we won. Oh, we, is it? So you contributed to that win, right? But by saying we won, you are associating yourself with that team. You get to get some of that reflected glory. But if their team lost, oh yeah, those guys over there, they lost. It's not we lost, those guys lost, right? You distance yourself from failure, but you associate yourself with success. And that last idea, that we distance ourselves from failure, is another phenomenon that we see a lot of as well in other contexts. You see this with sports. Sometimes if a team is doing really badly, then their own fans will start booing them, right? Why do they do that? Well, partly because it's sort of a psychological strategy of saying, you know, I'm not associated with this. I disapprove of them losing. I don't associate me, man, right? It's a way of cutting themselves off from failure so you don't have to feel bad about their failure. There was a study that looked at this where they had groups of participants perform some sort of task, and they later received bogus feedback. So the researchers just told them randomly that they either succeeded or they failed or they didn't get any feedback about their performance. And then all the participants were given the opportunity to take home a badge that represented their team. Now, what the researchers really want to know is how likely is it that people would choose to take home this badge? And if they were told prior that their group had succeeded at this task, then it's something like 65% or somewhere in there of people decided to take home this badge. Okay. If they got no feedback, that number was only about 50%. So right off the bat, we see that if you're told that you won, you're more likely to want to remind yourself of that group. You're basking in reflected glory, right? But maybe most interestingly is that if you look at the people who were told that their group failed at the task, that number drops dramatically to only 9% of people decided to take home this badge. If you are told that your team failed, you don't want to remind yourself of that team ever again. You want to cut yourself off from failure. So you're much less likely to take home a badge to remind yourself of that poor performance. Okay, so again, you can see all these strategies that are aimed at maintaining high self-esteem without ever having to lower our self-esteem. Your mother and I have seen your report card and we've decided to distance ourselves from you. So again, an example of trying to cut yourself off from failure. In this case, parents trying to cut themselves off from their kids' failure. But there's a sense, there's like a hint of truth to this, right? That's kind of what people do. Okay, there's two more processes I want to talk about quickly. So remember is it last class or 2 classes ago, whenever it was, we talked about social comparison, right? Where we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with similar other people. And I mentioned at the time that if you're trying to find accurate information about yourself, you will compare yourself to similar other people. I also mentioned at the time that we're often not motivated to find accurate information about ourselves. As we're talking about this class, we want to find self-enhancing information about ourselves. And when we want to feel good about ourselves, we don't tend to compare ourselves with similar other people. We specifically pick people who are worse off than us to compare ourselves with. That is called downward social comparison, because you're comparing yourself with someone who's worse off than you. So maybe you applied to, or maybe you apply to graduate school in the future, right? And you apply to 5 places, you get into your 3rd choice. And you're kind of feeling sort of bad about that. You didn't get into your top 2 choices, you got into your 3rd. You start thinking, but you know what? At least you're not this other person. They didn't get into any schools. At least you're not them, right? What you're doing, you could have compared yourself to someone who got into their 1st choice, but you're not going to, because that would make you feel bad about yourself, right? So what you say, well, at least I'm not the person who didn't get into any of the schools. At least I'm not that person. Whenever you hear someone say something like that, at least I'm not that, or it could be worse, they're engaging in downward social comparison. They are doing that to feel better about themselves because they're specifically picking someone who's worse off than them to compare themselves with. Okay, that's the idea of downward social comparison. And we do this all the time. We do this especially when our ego is bruised a little bit, when we feel threatened. If something bad happens to you, at least I'm not that person. So this allows us to feel better about ourselves. It allows us to cope psychologically when we're feeling threatened. I'll give you an example of this, of a researcher by the name of Shelley Taylor. She was a social psychologist who went to hospitals to talk to women who were suffering with breast cancer to find out how they coped with their disease. So she interviewed these women with breast cancer. So these are some examples. You don't need to copy down the next slide. But these are some examples of what some of the women said when she interviewed them. So she might interview a woman who had had a lump removed, and they would say, you know, how awful it must be for women who have had a full mastectomy, who have lost a breast, basically. So Shelley Taylor would go to a woman who had had a full mastectomy. And they would say something like, an older patient would say something like, you know, the people I feel sorry for are all these young girls. To lose a breast so young must be awful. At least I'm not them. So Shelley Taylor would talk to a younger mastectomy patient. And they would say something like, you know, if I hadn't been married, this thing would have really gotten to me. At least I'm not that person. And so every time she interviewed someone, they would say, at least I'm better off than this person. And then she would go to that person, and they would find some other person to downward social compare with. It got to the point where she was interviewing terminally ill women who would die from this disease, and they would say, it's not the worst thing that can happen. Some people have it worse than me. This is how these women coped with their disease, right? And the women who did this actually coped better. They had better outcomes by engaging in this downward social comparison process. Now, they could have compared themselves to people who didn't have breast cancer in the first place, but they didn't, because in order to maintain their self-esteem, they always picked a downward target to compare themselves with. And there's a sense in which that's kind of a rational strategy because it did actually help them cope, even though they're sort of deluding themselves a little bit. But the benefits of doing that, which is that they coped better, outweighed those sorts of costs. And we all tend to engage in this, in downward social comparison. Again, you can see people engage in this all the time. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about. So I apologize for going a little bit quickly the last few slides. But the one last process I want to talk about is something that's maybe the most counterintuitive psychological process that we have, which is something called self-handicapping. What self-handicapping is that under certain situations, we will handicap ourselves. We will sabotage our own performance in order to maintain self-esteem, which seems sort of odd, right? How does sabotaging yourself lead you to maintain self-esteem? Well, the idea is that, let's say that you have the exam on Thursday and you think you're going to fail. You haven't been going to class, you haven't been studying, you don't have the textbook, you think you're going to fail, right? You've got two options, two strategies. One strategy is to study as hard as you can between now and Thursday. But it's risky, because if you study as hard as you can and you still fail the exam, oh, that hurts your self-esteem, right? You have to admit that you tried as hard as you could, you still couldn't pass the exam. But there's a second strategy. What if instead of studying, what you do is you deliberately don't study? You don't open your textbook, you don't open your notes, you do nothing. You go into that exam on Thursday and you fail that exam. But you know what? You have an excuse for why you failed. You didn't fail because you're not good at social psychology. You failed because you're just too lazy to try. In other words, what you've done is, by sabotaging your performance by not studying, you have given yourself an excuse so that when you do fail, you can always just blame something else. It's not because of you're not intelligent, it's because you didn't study. So people will sabotage their own performance under some situations in order to give themselves an excuse for when they later fail. Now, we don't do this all the time. If you think you're going to pass the exam on Thursday, you're not going to engage in self-handicapping. Self-handicapping is kind of like a last resort. We engage in self-handicapping when we really don't think we're going to succeed at all. And so we might as well give us an excuse for when we do fail. So that could involve not studying before an exam, or drinking heavily the night before an exam, or not practicing a task, or just anything that gives you an excuse for why you failed, other than having to take responsibility for not having the ability to succeed at that task. And I'll very, very quickly describe the study here, and then we'll do the quiz. This is a study in which people were given a test and were given bogus feedback that they had actually done really well at this test, that in fact was really, really hard and no one really did well at it. The researchers were then told participants they were going to have to do a very similar test. And so all the participants are thinking, oh man, I'm going to fail this test. I did well in the first one because it was a fluke, but I'm going to fail the second test. And the researchers say, what we're doing in this study is we're testing the effects of two different drugs on performance. This first drug, which we've called Activil, we think is going to help your performance. The second drug, which we call Pandacrine, we think is going to harm your performance. So that's why we're giving you these two tests, to see if these drugs affect your performance in the second test. And I'll tell you what, I'll give you the option. Would you rather take Activil to help your performance, or Pandacrine to harm your performance? And what the majority of people in the study did is they chose specifically to take the performance harming drug, Pandacrine. Why? Because they didn't think they could pass that second test. And if they don't pass the test, that's going to really hurt their self-esteem. So in order to give themselves an excuse for failing that test that they thought they were going to fail, they deliberately chose to take the performance harming drug. So that way, when they fail, they can just blame the drug. They don't have to say it's not because I'm not smart, it's because of the drug. Okay, I apologize again for going a little bit quickly. I just wanted to make sure we got through all of this for the exam on Thursday. Got about 5 minutes left, so we're going to go into Top Hat and we're going to take the second quiz of the semester. And if anyone has questions about any of the material we've discussed, I can hang around for a few minutes after class and take those questions. Okay, so these questions all have to do with the self. This one has to do with some stuff we talked about last class. So question 1, we talked about how differences in cultures can lead to differences in how we view ourselves. Specifically, we discussed how Western cultures emphasize what, whereas Eastern cultures emphasize what else? And I'll let you read the options on your own. We've got 10 seconds left. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we talked about how in Western cultures, we tend to emphasize being an individual and standing out from the crowd, whereas in Eastern cultures, they tend to emphasize how you should function within the context of a group and how to interact, or I should say interact with others, but they define themselves in terms of their relationships with others, and they emphasize fitting in with the group. And so that is why A is the correct answer. Question number 2. Oops. We discussed a study today where trick-or-treaters were less likely to steal from a bowl of candy when a mirror was placed behind the bowl. Why was this the case? A, the mirror caused the kids to become aware of the situation and to think they were being watched. B, the mirror caused the kids to become self-focused and to behave in ways more in line with their thoughts of how they should behave. C, the mirror caused the kids to think about what it would feel like if other kids stole from them. D, the mirror was distracting and it took their attention away from thoughts of stealing. Got 10 seconds left. 3, 2, 1. Okay, and just to give you some context, that was just under a minute and a half. So I'm going to try to give you a minute and a half for each of the exam questions. So it's roughly that amount of time. I might give you a little bit more for the exam. And yeah, the questions will be somewhat similar in format to these, more or less. Okay, so why was that the case? Well, we talked about this in relation to self-awareness. And the idea is that the mirror makes people become self-focused, which makes them feel bad when they see that they're engaging in some unethical behavior. So it leads them to behave in ways that are more in line with their thoughts of how they should behave, which is option B. Question 3. Why do people engage in downward social comparison? Because it allows people to learn about themselves, it allows people to feel better about themselves, it gives people a target to strive towards, or it allows people to learn about others. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, we just talked about this, so this should be an easy one, I'm hoping. We engage in downward social comparison because it allows us to feel better about ourselves, right? If we want to learn about ourselves, we compare ourselves with people who are similar to us. If we want to feel better about ourselves, we compare ourselves to people who are worse than us. So that is option B. Good. Question 4, those who evade or who don't pay income tax, but who give generously to charity will probably over or underestimate the number of others who evade taxes and over or underestimate the number who give generously to charity. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the idea here is that when we're engaging in a negative behavior, we think everyone does it, right? Well, evading taxes, not paying income tax is a negative behavior. So we're gonna think everyone does that. So we're gonna overestimate the number of people who do that. But our positive behaviors, like giving to charity, we tend to underestimate people who do that so we can feel special, right? So as a consequence, we underestimate the number of people who give to charity. So B is, again, the correct answer. Okay, and finally, question 5, which is what we just discussed, the very last thing we discussed. We talked about a study where participants chose to take a drug that would impair or harm their performance on a later task. Why would they choose a drug that would harm their performance? Is it because they had a fear of success? Because they wanted to make themselves appear less competent? Because it gave them an excuse if they failed the task? Or D, because they didn't want the experimenter to ask them back for another experiment? Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so as we saw, we talked about this in relation to self-handicapping, and the reason why people self-handicap is because it gives them an excuse if they later fail the task, which makes C correct answer, and you guys aced it. Perfect. Okay, so just do that on the exam and things will be great in this class then. Okay, so as I said, I will hang around. If anyone has questions that you want to run by me, then I'll hang around for a few minutes to answer those. Sorry for going a few minutes over. I'll try not to do that again. And remember to make sure you're on time for Thursday at 3:30 so we can get started right away on those questions. Okay, good luck studying. I'll see you guys then. Bye.